Greetings and welcome to the introduction to astronomy. In this week's exploration of the solar system, we are going to discuss the Pioneer Venus probe and its studies of the planet closest to Earth in the solar system. So let's get started here. And the Pioneer Venus probe was launched in May of 1978 and arrived at Venus a few months later in December of the same year. And we can see here the orbit that it took and the orbit that it had around Venus. So this is as it's coming in there. You can see from the top the dashed line is as it came into its orbital insertion in early December of 1978. And we see that it had a very elliptical orbit. And that would mean that it comes very close into Venus. And we can see that on the left hand side. And that it went well away from Venus on the right hand side. So we can also see how the orbit changed between 1978 to 80 on the bottom and after the observation of Halley's comet. And we can see that the orbit was different in 1996, still a very elliptical orbit, but it was there for quite a while exploring Venus. Now, what did it do? Well, there were two parts to this probe. It had an orbiter. So the orbiter, one of its primary missions, was to complete a radar map of Venus. And we can see that here. Now, why a radar map? Well, Venus is completely covered in clouds. So you can't see the surface directly as you can with, say, our moon or even most of our Earth. That you cannot really see things because it's completely cloud covered. So here we can see that radar map showing that it really looks a lot like Earth. And in fact, you have higher level areas, especially up toward the polar region in the upper central regions there. And then another equatorial region that is present down below. Towards the equator, we see another that are continental areas. And then we have a lot of basins there. Now, if this were filled with water, those would be the ocean basins, and the higher areas would then be continents. But of course, Venus does not have that, does not have any water. So it is just all dry land all the way across. Now, in the other things that it studied was looking at the clouds and atmosphere. And here we see that it is completely shrouded in clouds. But it not looked at them not only in visible light here, but also ultraviolet and infrared light to be able to better observe. And the craft also studied Halley's comet when it passed close to the inner solar system back in 1986. Now, the other portion of this was what was called the multi-probe. And in fact, it was 4 probes, 1 main and then 3 smaller probes that descended through the atmosphere, giving us direct studies of the atmosphere. So 4 probes as pictured in the artist's conception here. The larger of the probes did have a parachute to allow it to descend slowly to the surface. The other 3 probes were not and just would have gone through the atmosphere, landing on the surface. One of those 3 actually survived impact and transmitted from the surface for a short period of time. But for the most part, we did not really get anything after we got the information going through the atmosphere. They were not intended to soft land on the surface of Venus as other craft had done in the past. And they studied things like the temperatures, the composition, and the pressures at various layers throughout the atmosphere of Venus, from the higher levels up above that we can see down to those right next to the surface. So let's go ahead and finish up with our summary. And what we've looked at today is that the Pioneer Venus probe had 2 parts. It had an orbiter, which was there for quite a while, and then the multi-probe, which descended through the atmosphere to give us direct measurements of the atmosphere. The orbiter specifically did various experiments, but specifically did a radar map of the surface, while the multi-probe was designed to study the atmosphere and give us some information on that. So that concludes this discussion on the Pioneer Venus probe. We'll be back again next time for another exploration of the solar system video. So until then, have a great day, everyone, and I will see you in class.